Hello, and welcome to this week's lecture segment on World War II. We're going to be spending some time today discussing the lead up to World War II, as well as major events of the war. And in order to address that, we absolutely need to start with the topic of post-war isolationism. Many of you are familiar with the fact that the Treaty of Versailles set up many challenges for individuals and nations, including the United States. Here in the United States Senate, which was tasked with ratifying the treaty, was reticent to do so because of the portion on the League of Nations, which tragically for Woodrow Wilson was the only truly original part of his 14 points that was included within the Treaty of Versailles. And so the fact that the Senate was hesitant to ratify the treaty due to the existence of the League of Nations was particularly tragic for Wilson. So tragic indeed that when he went on his whistle stop tour to try and get support for the League, he ended up suffering from a stroke, which made him rather ineffective for the remainder of his presidency. Now, following Wilson's presidency and all the way through the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, there was really a relative isolation from foreign entanglements. Voters really yearned for isolationism. In fact, Warren Harding completely dismissed of any validity of the League of Nations and told Americans that he, as well as his successors, did not feel it necessary to be involved on an international scale with other nations unless it was absolutely impossible to avoid. America saw a time of higher tariffs, Red Scare, backlash against the takeover of the Soviet, or the new Soviet Union, I should say, formation of the Soviet Union under the Communist Party. And they also, during this time period, sought to restrict immigration. It was felt that we should focus on the individuals already within the boundaries of the United States and not bring in additional issues and problems from abroad. The 1924 Johnson-Reed Immigration Act severely restricted immigration from less desirable countries, which were deemed to be pretty much any Southern and Eastern European nations, which had recently seen an influx of immigrants into the United States. Despite its isolationist tendencies, though, the United States could not entirely ignore its own global interests. By this point in time, of course, we have our own overseas possessions, places like Guam and the Philippines. We have global business connections in Asia and the Pacific, as well as within European countries, and many foreign investments. We did officially station unofficial observers at the League headquarters in Geneva, and also participated in international conferences on illegal drugs, arms, criminal traffic, women, children, economy, and culture during this time period. One other area in which we were dabbling in the international realm was with the concepts of war debts and reparations from the First World War. The war debt issue heightened American isolationism most because our allies during World War I were unable to pay for the American military supplies that they had purchased on loans during this time period. This, of course, infuriated many Americans because they expected the debt to be paid back, and then they would be using that money for purchases of military supplies for the United States. But the real issue of all of this was essentially the practical problem of repayment. In order to get money to pay the debts, Europeans had to sell goods to the United States, but the tariff wall severely impeded this. The French and the British also insisted that they could pay their debts after they collected the reparations from Germany that were owed to them. However, this entire structure collapsed during the Great Depression. During this era, Hoover negotiated a moratorium on both German and Allied debts, and ultimately, therefore leading to a lack of payment from Germany to the European nations during this time, making it even more challenging to bring income into the United States as the initial plan had been. The Johnson Debt Default Act was passed during this era, which prohibited even private loans to any government that defaulted on its debts to the United States. And with this stalling, the American and international economy were also reaching a standstill. During this era, there were also many attempts at disarmament. Many Americans thought that limitations on arms would bring about lasting peace, but due to the common concern of a Japanese threat, both Britain and America enlarged their naval armaments during the 1920s and early 1930s. Americans really had no desire for a large standing army. And during this time, the US military did shrink in actual size, but not in what it actually had in the realm of armaments, ships, and other war transportation. Following World War I, Japanese-American relations were strained because the Japanese were continuing their encroachment into Asia, which was something that the Americans were not very happy about. During the presidency of Warren Harding, the issues between the Japanese and Americans continued to escalate. Thus, Harding invited 8 foreign powers to a Washington armaments conference in an attempt to spread disarmament across the world. Delegates from the US, Britain, Japan, France, and Italy ended up signing what was known as the Five-Power Treaty as a result of this conference, which incorporated Secretary of State Charles Hughes's plan for tonnage limits on navies, as well as a moratorium for 10 years during which no new battleships would be built, and an agreement to refrain from fortification of Pacific possessions. What this Five-Power Treaty essentially did was partition the world. The US naval power would reign supreme in the Western Hemisphere, the Japanese in the Western Pacific, and the British in the North Sea. 2 other significant agreements also emerged from this conference. The Four-Power Treaty, which was between US, Britain, Japan, and France, where they agreed to respect one another's possessions in the Pacific, and the Nine-Power Treaty, which solidified the open door policy, continuing to allow all nations to compete for trade and investment opportunities in China. An indirect result of this Nine-Power Treaty as well was to also promise to respect the territorial integrity of China. And for those of you who are students of World War II, you will of course know how this will eventually go. As a result of these successes, Harding boasted of his diplomacy, and this relieved American citizens. The problem was that these agreements were without obligation and were not enforced. The tonnage limits that were initially established were only set on battleships and carriers, so navies were able to continue to expand in other fashions. And ultimately, Japan would withdraw from this agreement in 1934 because their desire to expand in Asia could not be quelled. A few other things to know from this post-war isolationism era include the establishment of the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And the Kellogg-Briand Pact began with French Foreign Minister Briand and our Secretary of State Kellogg. And essentially what it was a clever ploy by the French to draw the United States into their security system, which basically would inhibit the United States from seeking reprisals in response to French intrusions on neutral rights. Ultimately, though, Kellogg would turn the tables on Briand, and he countered with a scheme to have all nations sign the pact, which would ultimately become known as the Pact of Paris, and those who signed it were officially condemning war. And one of the things that Kellogg was able to work into the treaty was preservation of the Monroe Doctrine by claiming it was necessary for US self-defense. Lastly, during this era, we attempted to relieve resentments against Yankee imperialism in Latin America. Harding agreed to pay Colombia $25 million for the rights to the Panama Canal to repatriate for the seizure that we had done earlier in the century. We also pulled troops out of the Dominican Republic and initially pulled our Marines out of Nicaragua. However, they returned once civil war broke out in Nicaragua and stayed there until 1933. This unfortunately increased the strain of relationship between the United States and Mexico. and several diplomatic negotiations were necessary in order to maintain peace there. During this era, Calvin Coolidge notably traveled to Havana to open the Pan American Conference to announce our intentions to withdraw Marines from Nicaragua and Haiti. Herbert Hoover also toured Latin America, reversing Wilson's policy of refusing to negotiate with bad regimes. Hoover felt it was necessary to recognize and deal with the governments that were in power, regardless of their actions. And Roosevelt continued once he was elected to embrace the policy of the good neighbor. And he completely withdrew the Marines from Nicaragua and Haiti. He nullified the Platt Amendment, which effectively ended our right to intervene in Latin America, and promised to work with Latin American nations during the decades to come in order to defend against any outside invaders and to create an atmosphere of mutual safety. Americans as a whole, though, did retreat into isolationism during the 1930s. Roosevelt officially renounced support for the League of Nations. And despite the fact that his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, did not want isolationism, he still continued to pursue actions that continued to withdraw our nation from the international realm. Of course, with the Great Depression occurring at this time, there was lots of support for focusing on American-based issues. Unfortunately, one nation that was not willing to act in an isolationist fashion during this time was Japan. China, since 1905, had been enduring clashes with Russia, and these extended clashes convinced the Japanese that their own extensive investments in Chinese Manchuria were in danger. So in 1931, the Japanese began an occupation of Manchuria and said that the reason why that they had to get involved was because as the Chinese were expanding their railroad, they were intruding into Manchuria, and therefore the Japanese had to occupy Manchuria in order to protect their investments. This incident, of course, violated the Nine Power Treaty as well as other international agreements at this time. China asked the League of Nations and both the United States to help, but neither responded. However, Hoover did say that he was willing to install sanctions against Japan. However, there was not any concrete sanctions taken, and the Japanese continued to spread out their occupation, next occupying Shanghai. This did officially arouse Western action. The League of Nations at that point condemned Japanese aggression, and so Japan retaliated by withdrawing from the League. Eventually, a truce was reached, but Japan was still permitted to occupy these areas of the world. As all of this is going on in Asia, of course, we have Mussolini commencing the Italian conquest of Ethiopia, and Adolf Hitler, who's recently come to power, reoccupying the former demilitarized area of Germany known as the Rhineland in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. The French were unable to oppose German forces and received little support from other nations. And in Spain, a civil war is also installing a third fascist dictatorship. Fascism, a relatively new form of government, began when Benito Mussolini seized power in Italy. Fascism combines essentially the core tenets of nationalism and also some elements of socialism. Mussolini's promise was to restore order and pride to the Italian people, and at the time was held in very wide appeal. Once in power, Mussolini abandoned the supposedly socialist components of his platform and suppressed opposition to against anyone who pointed out that he was not upholding his campaign goals. Adolf Hitler, of course, who came into the German political leadership scene in January of 1933, was the German counterpart of Mussolini. He was the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, which was a fascist party that had steadily rose in influence during the 1920s. In January of 1933, the impotence of the Weimar Republic offered Hitler an opening by resulting in his appointment to the position of chancellor, akin to that of the US vice president. by Paul von Hindenburg, the president of Germany at that time. The situation in Germany unfolded in such a way that Hitler was able to, shortly after his appointment, win dictatorial powers from a very subservient Reichstag. And following the Reichstag fire in February of 1933, Hitler was able to assume absolute emergency powers, which he utilized to persecute Jews, socialists, and to outrightly defy the Treaty of Versailles, including pulling Germany out of the League of Nations. Unfortunately, the already beaten down European democracies that surrounded Germany were unwilling to act because they were just so overwhelmed yet by their recovery from the First World War, coupled with the onset of the Great Depression worldwide. By 1938, it was evident that the peace of Europe was going to be challenged. Hitler formed the Union of Austria and Germany in March of 1938 by annexing Austria in an event known as the Anschluss. That fall, he took over the Sudetenland territory in Czechoslovakia. And although there were initially motions by Britain and France to stop this takeover, the rest of the world felt that it would just be easiest to allow Hitler to retain this territory and promise that he would not conquer further. Of course, the following spring, he seized the remaining territory in Czechoslovakia and seized Lithuania while Mussolini was simultaneously conquering Albania. And then on September 1st, 1939, shortly after signing a non-aggression pact with Soviet Russia, Hitler invaded Poland, and Britain and France were forced to honor their commitment to go to war if Poland was invaded. So what had initially been dubbed the Sitzkrieg for a lack of action by the European countries surrounding Germany soon erupted into a blitzkrieg, a lightning war. By the following February, Nazi troops occupied Denmark and landed on the Norwegian coast, quickly leading to the fall of Denmark. Hitler then unleashed bombers on Belgium and the Netherlands, and British troops felt challenged when the Germans quickly reached the English Channel. German forces outflanked forts on France's eastern front, the Maginot Line, and soon after, the Germans took Paris and the French submitted to an official surrender. At this point in time, it appeared that Britain stood alone in the European continent. Winston Churchill was effective at resisting Germany, but was quickly asking the Americans to get involved. However, Roosevelt felt that it would take time for America to create a viable military force, but did begin to, behind the scenes, call for a military buildup. Although the Americans officially attempted to remain neutral, Churchill's appeal for military supplies led to the War and Navy departments following Roosevelt's orders to release arms and munitions in a series of pieces of legislation known as the Lend-Lease Acts, where Americans would lend military supplies to Allied powers in exchange for leases on military bases retained by those Allied powers worldwide. This world crisis essentially transformed Roosevelt. He felt revitalized by the war in Europe and was willing to exert authority on behalf of Britain. He set up a National Defense Research Committee to coordinate research and an effort to develop an atomic bomb, which would eventually become known as the Manhattan Project. To bolster national unity, Roosevelt named 2 Republicans in defense posts in his cabinet, Henry Stimson as the Secretary of War and Frank Knox as the Secretary of the Navy. Throughout the summer of 1940, the battles of Britain occurred in which the Royal Air Force outfought the German Luftwaffe over the skies of Britain. Despite the fact that Hitler desperately wanted to seize England, he was unable to do so, and his resources became increasingly strained in that area. Roosevelt felt that it would be necessary to step in sooner than later. However, at this point in time, he was unwilling to actually send in American troops. There was a pretty significant isolationist movement in the United States led by a group known as the America First Committee, which included Herbert Hoover and pilot Charles Lindbergh. Despite the fact that many Americans on the surface were isolationists, there was increasing concern that the Western democracies had been quickly overtaken by Hitler and that Britain would be unable to hold off for much longer. Of course, all of this would ultimately change in December of 1941. But before we get to that, of course, we do undergo another presidential election. At this point in time, FDR has served 2 terms, which is the most ever served by a US president to date. And so the question arose as to what should be done. Should the Democrats nominate FDR for another term, or should they have him step aside and nominate another candidate? It was determined in 1940 that due to the escalation of war in Europe, that Roosevelt should remain the candidate for president from the Democratic Party. The Republicans put forth a gentleman by the name of Thomas Dewey. And although we know today, of course, that newspaper headlines proclaimed Dewey's initial victory, Roosevelt was able to capture his narrowest margin of victory yet and retain the hold on the presidency. So Roosevelt is in office for another term and continues to expand upon the Lend-Lease bill. The Lend-Lease bills, again, allowed the president to sell, lease, or dispose arms to any country whose defense was vital to U.S. security. It was substantially opposed by the isolationists who saw it as a point of no return. However, many individuals within the Republican Party were opposed to it. Of course, the war has rapidly expanded by this point, both in Europe and Asia. In the European front, Italy enters the war as Germany's ally and launches attacks on Greece and Egypt. German forces under Rommel also join the Italians in Libya and force the British withdrawal, and the Nazis are overwhelming Yugoslavia and Crete. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria also join with the Axis powers, and it becomes evident that relations between the Germans and Soviets are becoming strained. In the Asian front, in the Pacific, Japan continues to conquer territory, and it is felt that they may be unable to be stopped. The US had already been attempting to maintain limited relationships with the Japanese, but it would be during this time period in 1940 and throughout the bulk of 1941 that relationships between Japan and the United States would take a turn for the worse. The Tokyo government at that time signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, which was a pledge to declare war on any nation that attacked any of them. And simultaneously, the Japanese also signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. The Japanese also announced a protectorate of French Indochina, which really infuriated FDR and caused him to take three specific steps in response. As a result of the takeover of French Indochina, Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the US. He restricted oil exports to the Japanese, and then also officially merged the armed forces of the Philippines with the US Army and put General Douglas MacArthur in charge. The oil restrictions would eventually become an embargo and set the United States and Japan on a collision course that would, of course, ultimately lead to a day that will live in infamy. So Americans were so focused on the war in the Atlantic that they were caught completely off guard by the attack of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. On this day, more than 2,000 military and civilians were killed, and as a result of it, the United States officially declares war on Japan. Negotiations had been ongoing, but the Japanese had abruptly broke off diplomatic negotiations in the hours leading up to Pearl Harbor, and Japanese forces missed the major aircraft carriers that were docked there, as well as onshore facilities and oil tanks, but would set a significant setback to the United States Navy, which would allow Japanese forces to quickly invade the Philippines, Guam, Midway, Hong Kong, and the Malay Peninsula. This action, of course, immediately ended American neutrality, and as a result of the tripartite agreement, Hitler and Mussolini also declared war on the United States once the US declared war on Japan. So, despite the setbacks that were brought on by Pearl Harbor, the United States was able to regroup and halt Japanese advances on Australia in two significant battles in 1942. The Battle of the Coral Sea, despite significant losses to American forces, the Japanese were repulsed and set back. And then the Battle of Midway, which would be truly the turning point in the Pacific, a major morale boost and leap forward, which was an American surprise attack that demonstrated that aircraft carriers, not battleships, would be decisive elements in the war in the Pacific. Unfortunately, while this was going on, German submarine wolf packs were wreaking havoc in the Atlantic. But by the end of 1942, significant strategies were put in place that would allow for the progress to be made in the Atlantic Ocean. At this time, Roosevelt began to set the United States on a course of war production. He had staggering production goals for U.S. military equipment because his purpose was to confront the enemies with crushing superiority of just sheer might and armaments. Roosevelt was able to work with Congress to pass the Revenue Act, which provided a $7 billion influx into the American economy and brought in the tax structure to bring in additional costs to help pay for the war. They also launched war bond drives and began to work with women to bring them into the workforce to hopefully cover for those men that would soon be going overseas to the war. World War II, of course, ultimately would have many social effects, some positive and some negative. The migration of workers to new defense jobs in the West had many demographic effects. Many African Americans, as they had been during the First World War, were also lured to the Midwest due to higher wages and job openings. And there were many opportunities for women, not only in the workforce, but also in the military to serve as nurses and in organizations such as the Women's Army Corps, the Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Army Air Force. The most volatile issue, though, that was ignited socially was African American participation in the military. Of course, with this participation, there were many demands for equality, despite the fact that segregated units did continue. There were opportunities for African Americans to attend flight school, and of course, we know of the Tuskegee Airmen. But unfortunately, on the home front, there was a lot of segregation and discrimination in the workforce. And there was some racial violence that occurred, not only against African Americans, but also against the increasing influx of Mexican Americans that began to serve in the wartime industry era. Native Americans also performed a vital role in World War II. Not only in the home front, but also in the military themselves. Indian servicemen were actually put into normal Army units, non-segregated Army units. And probably the most famous example of service by Native Americans would be the Japanese code, or excuse me, the Navajo code talkers, which would create a code that was unbreakable by the Japanese. And the saddest, of course, of all of these would be the internment of Japanese Americans, which began in February of 1942 when Roosevelt initiated the removal of Japanese Americans from homes and residences in California when he issued Executive Order 9066 and forced these individuals to sell their farms and businesses, and of course, massively violated their civil liberties. Although it was upheld by the United States Supreme Court, this mass violation of civil liberties was an injustice that would only be truly recognized after the war ended and ultimately resulted in compensation to those who were interned. There were some Japanese Americans during the war itself that actually served in the US military in what were known as specialized Nisei regiments. So the very first war strategy by the United States was to defeat Hitler first. The successes at Midway and the Coral Sea allowed for a larger focus on Hitler. And despite the fact that more American troops were going to the Pacific than the Atlantic, the military strategists really focused on the European front. And there was a plan by the United States to pledge full resources to war and not make a separate peace with the Axis powers, that all of the Allied powers would have to make peace together. By this point in time, of course, too, the Germans have turned against the Soviet Union. So the Soviet comes on board as an allied power, which makes for rather interesting relations. In addition to fighting in Europe, battles were also fought against the Germans and Italians in North Africa, where successes were gained rather quickly. And then also in the actual Atlantic Ocean itself. Mussolini soon lost his power in Italy and was dismissed by King Emmanuel III, which caused a disintegration of the Italian army and was also, of course, a benefit to the Allied powers. But it would really be some simultaneous actions in 1944 that would coalesce in the invasion of the beaches of Normandy, France, in an event today we call D-Day, occurring on June 6, 1944, that the true liberation of Europe from Hitler would begin. As a result of the successes of D-Day, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met in Tehran, Iran, in what would become known as the Declaration of Cairo. Knowing that the defeat of Hitler would be imminent, the three powers affirmed that war against Japan would continue until Japan's unconditional surrender and territory being restored to China. That the three promised to not only stay together until that was accomplished, but also after the war to create an international organization, the United Nations, to maintain peace. Unfortunately, as we know from our other discussion during this era, we also unfortunately are seeing mass tragedy in Europe. And just wanted to share this brief video to bring in the concept of the Holocaust. Okay, so as the Holocaust, of course, is drawing to a close, so is the war in Europe. And as the war in Europe comes to a close in 1945, we, of course, also want to make mention of the fact that Roosevelt has been elected now to an unprecedented fourth term. His vice president had been angering Southern conservatives and Northern city bosses due to his ties with labor unions. So for his fourth term, Roosevelt compromised with party members and chose Harry Truman to be his new vice president. They were able to successfully fend off another challenge from Republican Thomas Dewey. Leading up to the close of the war on the European front, the big three once again met, this time in Yalta. And what they wanted to ensure as a result of this conference was a solidification of a plan for the post war world. And also, Roosevelt wanted to ensure that the Soviet Union would join the war against Japan once the Germans were officially beaten back. These things were accomplished, although there was some dissension over the boundaries of Eastern European countries following the war. At the time, the Soviets promised to respect the boundaries and the free elections, democracy, and constitutions of those nations. But as we know, it would make very little difference in the end. By April of 1945, Nazi collapse is imminent, and Roosevelt will die in early April to be succeeded by his vice president, Harry Truman. Hitler will die shortly thereafter, and on May 9th, 1945, Victory over Europe Day occurs. The focus now completely turns to the war in the Pacific. Allied forces had brought the war within reach of the Japanese homeland by 1944. However, the Japanese continued to put up a significant fight against Generals MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz. And although there were significant gains that were made in the Pacific, the Japanese continued to fight to the death with their suicide pilots and kamikaze units. Although the gains by the Allied forces against Japan were significant, by August of 1945, as you can see here by this map, ultimately decided by the Allied powers that the only way a defeat of Japan could be accomplished and further loss of life could be stemmed was through the use of atomic bombs. Research for the atomic bomb project had begun in 1940 and was spread throughout the United States in order to prevent any enemies from finding out the secrets of the atomic bomb. Testing was done in the desert in early 1945, and the only major dilemma that remained was how to actually use the two bombs that were available for the US military to use. It was decided that the priority target would be Hiroshima because it was the assembly point for Japanese naval convoys. And President Truman decided to order the atomic bomb to be dropped if the Japanese did not surrender before August 3rd. Of course, as we know, ultimately two bombs would be dropped in Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. The initial bomb resulted in the immediate death of 80,000 people. And of course, subsequent fallout from both bombs would result in deaths for years to come. But the ultimate result was accomplished, and MacArthur did accept the surrender of the Japanese and settled up for post-war occupation of Tokyo. Ultimately, this would be the costliest conflict in history. The Soviet Union suffered the greatest losses, and of course, out of all of the Allied powers, the US losses were the least. World War II would have profound effects on American life and society. It stimulated increase in productivity and employment and ended the Great Depression. It also led to the introduction of new technologies as well as new opportunities for women and African Americans. The Democratic Party, of course, benefited from the war effort by solidifying its control of the White House and Congress, the expansion of the federal government, as well as the increase of both presidential prestige and authority. And our views on isolationism, of course, decreased, allowing a new era for the United States in the world arena, which would ultimately lead to an accelerated growth of US power, making the United States the strongest nation on earth, but bringing forth the Soviet Union as the greatest power in Eurasia. As we move into our next unit, we're going to see that domestically, human rights, because of some of the gains made during World War II, would now be on a bigger stage. That is all that I have for you today. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.